Message for today: in God we trust, all others pay cash. I'm going to abbreviate this. I'll probably put the hour-long one up later on as well, but this one's for Dave at Dave's Automotive out there in Utah. You did a thing on the Cummins 6.7 engine on the fuel system, burning a hole in the piston. I thought I'd go through something that happened with me about 10 years ago. Probably less than that, but we'll say 10 years for the fun of it. And what we had here is a Komatsu WA450-6. Now, that may or may not mean anything to you out there in Utah, because anything that has to do with mining and construction out there probably is bigger. This is a bucket that anywhere between 3.5 and 5.5 yards. We used to call it a 4 yard. Apparently 4.5 yard, depending on the bucket and material that you put on it. 270 horsepower, 11 liter engine, 674 CID, SAA. That's correct, not a stutter. 6D 125E-5 Komatsu engine. This is only important because of the size and the cost of it. Now, the S is turbocharged, A is aftercooled, AA is air aftercooled. I should say A is intercooled, but they'll call it aftercooling in the construction world. AA is air-to-air aftercooled. So we have SAA. Now we got that far in the engine. We know it's turbocharged. You know it's aftercooled. Air aftercooled. Like a radiator, obviously. 6D, as in 6-cylinder diesel. Then 125, that's the bore in millimeters, roughly, give or take a little. And then E5, it's emissions engine stage. Well, in this case, the fifth. It's actually the fourth iteration because the Japanese hate the number 4. And number 4 to them is Apollo 13. Only worse. So that's why this one's E5 instead, because the previous engine was E3. Now, I can't remember if this one had EGR on it or not. I believe it did, but I can't speak to it precisely. I'm thinking it didn't, on one hand. So if you happen to be patient enough to listen to my other one that I'll post later that was an hour long, describing many things that I've been through over the years, with similar managerial failures of ignorance, where you hire IBM manager types rather than hiring experienced technical types like you, Dave, owning the business. You've done the work, you know the results of it, and you're out there on the floor. That's a different world. But anyway, when we go through this, you get an idea of the size of the engine. 270 horsepower, 11 liters, 674 cubic inch. That's a good size engine. Individual cylinder heads all the way across the board, solid block. The EGR on this one is different than some of the others that were in this, being computer controlled. Most of them actually had a hydraulic pump on this thing to operate the EGR valving, as well as the wastegates on the turbo. But that's where it starts getting into, I don't believe this had all of that on it. So even though the E5 usually means that it has an EGR, I'm balking on this one because we had two engines at the same time. But let's say it does have EGR. To this, it was irrelevant. What we had in this was a call that they had trouble with the machine preparing to overheat, and they were losing coolant. And I got up there and opened and listened to it and said, well, that's kind of funny. Let me do something. Climbed up on it. Didn't take me but a few minutes. Climbed up on the machine and pulled the radiator cap. And looked inside and said, okay, fire it up. And then all of a sudden, up through funny colored coolant, little bubbles started, teeny little microscopic bubbles start coming up through. Not quite foaming, but darn near. So I said, hit the throttle a few times. Vroom, vroom. Said, put it right to the boards. And then it starts coming up through faster. But it didn't get to rolling, but it came up through faster. So back off, and it went down. Shut it off, and it went away. Start it up. Did it again. Went through the cycle. Identical. I said, oh, okay. We figured it out. So I had the operator come out and look at it, and I think the owner went up in the cab. I think he did. Either he did or I did, and I showed it to him. I said, watch this. Fires it up. Bubbles come up. He's laughing. Yeah, we figured. Really? Yeah, not exactly that, but we figured there was something like that, the way it was running. And so, okay. And when we get the machine from back to the shop, because now we have to pull the heads. He'd rather the head it was back at the shop, pull the heads, because he says, what if you need to do anything else? Well, then we'll pull the engine out, take it back, bring it up here. Just take the whole machine, he says. It's no good to me here. It's clogging up space. Okay, cool. Now, this is a guy who is running a quarry near Cargill up along in the Finger Lakes. And, I mean, when he needs to be, he's cheap as nails. And when he said, take it back to the shop, he already had everything in his head what he wanted to do. That was the best part about this whole thing. And I was smiling. I said, well, it might be cheaper off replacing the engine. You think? Tom was a great guy this way. But we got along from the beginning. The first time I was up there with Tom, he had one of the electronic connectors underneath the machine. It was actually, this one was electrical, supposedly sealed, got attacked by salt. I said, oh man. So I stripped everything. We had solder seal connectors. And I stripped everything I could get my hands on and went up there with it. You're going to leave us with nothing. What? Is there 40 or 60 pins that I'm replacing there? Yeah, I stripped the place dry. So I get up there, and first thing in the shop, I start looking at it, and Tom comes out and looks at me and says, so how are you going to fix that? You just going to put it together or solder it, or are you going to crimp it, or put some heat shrink over it? What are you going to do? And I said, no, I'm not going to solder it. I said, that's just something else to go rot. And I said, and if I solder it and just put heat shrink on it, the heat shrink's going to do nothing more than be a place for your salt water to get in there and capillary refill in, and it'll rot faster than anything else almost, because now you have two metals in there. I said, if I do a heat shrink crimp, same thing. It doesn't seal, and it walks in there and gets it as well. So I said, the only thing I've got here is solder seals, and you're still going to have trouble, but a solder seal is your best bet. They said, what do you mean? I said, well, you put it on, seal the ends, and then let the solder do its thing. I said, anything else is just, it's a waste of time. I'll be back here in a month or two with your salt environment. He said, all right, great. I like your thinking. I got a whole pile of them here, and I wanted to be sure you knew what you were doing before I gave you my stuff to put in. So that's the kind of customer we're talking about here. He's been good through the years that I was there. Tough. I enjoyed the tough ones. Most of them were fun. Every once in a while you'd get one of those that come off. I had one guy that I sat there and said, well, you didn't heat it enough. And I looked at him and said, well, I used to overhaul engines. Once you get up to about 5 or 550 degrees, I said, now anything that's Loctite is going to be out of there. I said, now we're talking trouble. When you hit 6 or 650, now the color, as well as some of the tempering and any heat treating that this might have, is starting to slowly disappear. I said, once you pass 650 to 700 degrees, you start turning dark blues and dark blues. And I said, you're changing the actual metal structure of that yoke on the transmission. So I said, if you want me to, I'll be happy to heat that thing up. You'll have to get a new yoke, because sooner or later that'll come undone. And he says, well, I'm an engineer, and I've done this for years, and I went through, and I smiled and said, oh, good. So my numbers are accurate. Yeah. So a tough customer, I don't mind. A tough customer that's reasonable, I don't mind. A tough customer that's just out to be abusive, no. A manager that's just abusive, you're going to have a bad day. When I was younger, not so much. When I got older and earned respect, oh yeah, no, we don't back off. We don't go the whole hog screaming. Don't play the insubordination game, but we walk right on that line because we know where it is. It's like, don't play games with me, buddy. I'm not covering for your stupidity, kind of thing. You got somebody that works with you, comes out and talks with you, I'm your guy. Even if there's a disagreement, I'll hear you all the way out. And if you're the owner or the manager that has to stand for it, and there's a disagreement, and I think I can get it in there and make it work, and you're going to take the fall for it, I'm on board. But if you're going to have me take the fall or tell the story because somebody will believe, no, I'm the last guy in the planet. So on this one with Tom, that's one of the reasons he was happy I showed up and started with the project. In fact, I found out later on he asked. He says, nothing against Kevin. Kevin's a good guy and a hard worker. They're both honest guys. But he says, I need a tech guy. So Kevin was tech, but just not quite as in-depth and experienced as I was. Still is, Kevin. Still working. And there's some things that he does that infuriate people because he'll walk up to a machine, run it, and without even doing any other troubleshooting knows what's wrong because he operated it and he knows the signs and symptoms without getting technical. So there's something to be said for that too. So in this one, when he brings the machine back, I start tearing it apart and doing the forensics on it, and we find water in the fuel filter before anything else happened. So, and we also know that there's going to be a problem in the radiator. I never even looked at that, except what little I was doing in there, and the coolant was all foggy, so I couldn't see the cores. Kevin told me later, yeah, you couldn't see the cores because the fog you saw was the stuff over the core. But that was later, after the engine was in. So when we get down there, we made the list of everything this thing needed. And the overhaul, made them go nuts. Well, why can't you do this? And why can't you want this right or not? Well, a customer walks in and says, tell you what, I want a complete engine in there. And what can you do for me for financing? Well, because of financing, he got like a 10 or 15% break with no interest. So there's a lot to be said about what the customer was angling for. And he already knew more than the management that came to the shop, what he was going to do in the first place. We put the engine in, and in between, they said, all right, when are we going to take tank out? So what do you mean? You got to take tank out. It's got to be clean. Just drain it. What? Just drain it. No. So like Kevin said, there's probably a leak in there with that much water in the filter. We drained the filter, fired it up, it filled up with water again. It only takes a couple of gallons down there. It wouldn't even run if it had that in there. I said, the tube doesn't go to the bottom. It sucks up what water it can across here, separates it, and drops it in there. Couldn't get him to understand that. So what had happened was water went through, wiped out the fuel system, and Kevin and I knew that already. We knew it was overheating as it was, and we knew why. Didn't need to go looking further. With the head gasket leak, I found one little place where it could come out, which explained the foam, or semi-foam that was in there, the little mini bubbles. And he said, well, what about a crack? I said, well, everything's got to go out to be crack checked. He said, the sleeves is irrelevant. Well, what if it's just a pinhole in the sleeve? Yeah, so what if it is? Doesn't matter. The heads have to go out to be completely redone. So then we have to check the standout on all the sleeves. Why? What do you mean, why? It was a head gasket that leaked through the fire ring. The number one thing there is the sleeve stand. We had to go through all of this like I was talking to a kindergartner with an adult voice. So finally the customer took care of the problem and says, I want an engine. Remand, because I get Cummins warranty, financing, money off, and I get a, right? So then anything goes wrong, you have to come back, which we did. We had to come back, take care of the radiator, and the machine came back to the shop to take care of the tank after we had, I think, 2 pumps and 1.5 sets of injectors for water ingestion. And yes, I transfer pump. 1 transfer pump, 2. This is my second time through this. And I believe we replaced the transfer pump, the main pump twice, high pressure pump, and 1.5 sets of injectors. And being that the manager hated me, he wanted to find something else that was going on because he just thought I was doing things to screw him up. They pulled an injector apart, and from sitting for a week, the water that was in there was so contaminated with crap in it that it started to rust the 2-way valve that they took apart on top of the injector. And literal water droplets came out because all the little water that'd been in the system got through the separator and in there and actually coagulated, so to speak. It got back together, congealed into a bead. He pulled it apart, water fell out, rust in the injectors. He said, hey, look at that, water. Duh. Well, we had to take it apart to confirm it. I said, yeah, that's because you people are too stupid to accept the fact of water in the separator. Well, that's why you get written up for attitude. And I said, I get written up for attitude because the obvious is in front of your face, and you people still have to fight about it all the way to the last end. I said, then you call yourself a political conservative. This is hysterical. Yes, I did add that one in there to him because he thought he was a libertarian/conservative. Every day we had to hear about that. Oh, yeah. I was what he thought he was. I am what he thought he was. And still I had to harass him. They tore apart injector after injector. And I said, oh, you want to tear? Hey, why don't you tear apart the main pump? Shut up. Well, the water separator didn't do its job. I said, the water separator? And before I could finish, Kevin was screaming, you idiot, the water separator was full of water. When it's full, what's it going to do? Well, they didn't drain it enough. So, Kevin launched into a great big huge thing because this is how ridiculous this is. He had drained the water, fired the machine up. He drained the water out, which is difficult on this one because the separator is above the tank, so it screws things up. When you get done draining the water, you have to hand pump the primary full of fuel again. It's not like it's gravity fed. It's a little bit of a process. And he did that twice. And when he fired the machine up and let it run a couple of minutes, he says you could literally sit there and watch the water come in, hit the separator, and run down and fill the cup up slowly. And he started screaming at him. I showed you that twice. What more do you want? So that's why that you could say that I shouldn't have had the attitude that I was written up for, but I had to have the attitude that Kevin and I and others were all written up for in that place. In fact, we had 3 guys come in for internships, and all 3 were asked at different times separately. We found out later on because they came together when they talked about it too. And they found out the 3rd one was the same. He was there a year or 2 before them, and from 2 different colleges, I might add. And he said, all of them are asked the same question. So how long do you think it'll take you to get up to his level? What do you mean? Oh, Seth's level or even Kevin's level. What? How long? So I don't know how long they've been doing it. I don't know. At the time, 10, 12 years. I think at one time it was 14 years. And he said, what do you mean? Well, how long's he been doing it? He says, well, he's been here in the company 14 years. Okay, 14 years. What are you talking about, 14 years? He can't take it. He says, you got to be kidding me. He looked at one of them and said, to get to their level? Well, you've got the latest and greatest college education. He says, yeah, and it's nothing like what they taught us. Not even close. He said, what do you mean? He says, yeah, we got the latest and greatest information. We don't have their experience. He says, it'd take all that many years to gain that kind of experience. He says, we know that now. He said, well, that's because they taught it to you. And he says, yeah, that's because they did teach it to us. And that's how important you walking the floor, Dave, teaching these guys, even though they might know, and you getting your nose in there and writing it down. The other part of this is you know what's going on with the operation. So when you sit down and talk to the customer, your mechanic is already backed up before anything happens. And if the customer talks to the mechanic, it doesn't make any difference, does it? Because there is no disagreement. There are so many things about the arrangement that is problematic because I've been in those service shops where the boss wants the guy to think this and this customer and play that. No. But when you're in an honest, straightforward shop and you're still teaching your people, but you're keeping yourself taught up to that level or beyond, that is a beautiful thing. Keep it up, Dave.